Okay, we have almost 200 people with us now. I think it's a good time to start. So hi everyone, my name is Nir Goldstein. I'm the Managing Director of G5 Israel, and welcome to our webinar about the science of alternative protein that will be led by our Director of Science and Technology, Dr. David Welch. First of all, I hope you're all safe and healthy in this very challenging time. And we invite you to join us for an hour of escapism and learn about the science of alternative protein from the world's best. A few technical issues here at the bottom. I think you have a Q&A button. Please use it. Any questions that you have, please submit it in English, and we will take questions at the end of David's presentation. We are recording this webinar, and we will also share with you the presentation itself in an email that will follow later on. The schedule for today, we're going to have a brief introduction by myself. David's presentation is going to be the majority of our session today. We're going to have a few minutes for Q&A at the end, and we're also going to show you a bit of our resources. A bit about G5, what do we do? So G5 is working worldwide to accelerate alternative protein, meaning we are working to harness the power of food innovation and the market in order to accelerate both plant-based and cultivated meat. And we are working also not only with meat, but also with eggs, dairy, fish alternatives. We are promoting all of those technologies and products because we believe that these technologies can really support the movement in order to make a more sustainable, healthy, and just food system. How do we do it? Well, we are working in three main work streams: science and technology, corporate engagement, and policy in the world and also here in Israel. When I say science and technology, it means that we are working with scientists and researchers all around the world and really support them hands-on with research regarding alternative protein. For instance, you will see today a bit of what we are doing regarding mapping of white spaces. We are working very closely with scientists again, and we can see what is missing in the academic world nowadays. We also have a fund that is funding alternative protein research. Just this week, we announced another investment of about $4 million. And in Israel nowadays, we have about $1 million of investment in alternative protein research, including in the Technion, the Hebrew University, Tel Aviv, Tel Chai, and more is coming. Regarding corporate engagement, we are working with the world's biggest food, agriculture, pharma, and equipment companies in order to support them in accelerating this revolution of the food system. We are helping them in penetrating the market. We are also working with investors, assisting them in identifying opportunities and evaluating them. And we are working with entrepreneurs. For example, we have a startup manual to assist entrepreneurs in building successful startups. Regarding policy, we are working all around the world with governments. On the one hand, we are asking them to assist with additional funding for open access research to this field. And on the other hand, also working in the field of regulation, which in new foods is sometimes very challenging. All of our services are free of charge, and we are working to support anyone who is involved in this field. You can see here at the bottom that G5 has earned Guide Stars seal of transparency, which means we are rather impactful at what we do, and I think we can consider the world's leading organization in alternative protein. On the right, you can see where we are located. So the majority of our staff is in the US, but we also have very exciting branches in Brazil, India, Europe. We have branches right now in London and Belgium. In Asia, we are located in India, Hong Kong, and mainland China, and more is coming. And here in Israel, we are working to promote the Israeli innovation and bring it out to the world to support this food revolution. And now it is my honor to present to you David. So David Welch holds a PhD in plant developmental cell biology. He has vast experience in the life science industry, where he held various positions in both business development, marketing, and product management. Lucky for us, he joined G5 2 years ago in 2017. And since he's been the Director of Science and Technology, where he oversees our really impressive team of scientists. So David, it's an honor to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nir, and hello to everyone. I'm just sharing my slides. Give me 1 second, please. All right, it's really nice to be here today to talk to you about the science of alternative proteins. As Nir mentioned already, what GFI is focused on is accelerating the alternative protein industry. And he mentioned also that one of the primary ways we do this is by identifying white space opportunities in the alternative protein industry. And this informs much of the work we do, from directing the grants that we fund that Nir mentioned, to advising companies and governments and universities around the world, to creating case studies and white papers, and even helping us advise new research centers that form to study alternative proteins in more depth. And we recently worked with a number of external experts to identify the most important white space opportunities, and I'll be talking to you about those in my webinar today. But one of the main questions that drives our thinking when we're approaching white space ideas is this question about feeding the 10 billion or close to 10 billion people that will live on our planet by the year 2050 in a way that's sustainable and safe and nutritious. And one way to think about this is by looking at the amount of land we have on the planet to grow food. So if you look at the Earth's surface, about 30% of it is comprised of land, the remainder being water. Of that 30%, we currently use about 70%. About 70% of that is habitable. The remainder is either glaciers or barren land that we're unable to either live on or grow food on. And of that 70%, about half of it is used today for agriculture, the remainder being forests and shrubland and urban spaces where we live and work. And I think all of you would agree that we don't want to deplete our forests and shrubland any more than we have already. So we're currently working with that 50%. Today, we use over 3/4 of it for livestock production. So that's either to grow the crops that we feed to the animals or land that we use to grow the animals themselves. And just 1/4 is used to grow crops that we feed to humans. But what's interesting is when you look at the amount of protein that we get from those two sources, it's almost reversed. So that 3/4 of the land that we use to produce livestock provides just 1/3 of our protein supply through meat and dairy, whereas the 1/4 we use for crop production for human consumption provides 2/3 of our protein supply. So what's the reason for that? Well, one of the primary reasons is just the inbuilt inefficiency of the animals we use to produce food. If you take the chicken, which is the most efficient of livestock animals that we use today, it takes 9 calories of energy in to produce just 1 calorie of food that we can eat. And this is really just due to chickens being animals like you and me. They need fuel to think, to move around, to breathe. And this isn't going to change. And in fact, many of the other animals that we use for food are far less efficient than the chicken. And there are other issues as well with our food system today. One of the most pressing is antimicrobial resistance. In the US, over 70% of our antibiotics are used for or consumed by animals. And today, estimates show that antimicrobial resistance or superbugs cause roughly about 700,000 deaths annually. But if this is left unchecked and we don't solve this, it could cause up to 10 million deaths by 2050. So that's more than all cancers combined, and cause the global health system around $100 trillion by 2050. I think you're all aware of some of the environmental impacts of our industrial animal agriculture food system. And this is an interesting slide because it shows just that if we look at just the top 20 meat and dairy companies, their emissions actually rival those of developed countries such as Germany, Canada, and the UK. And overall, livestock emissions account for at least 14% of all emissions, so that's more than all of transport combined. And then finally, market disrupting events such as zoonotic diseases and foodborne diseases can have enormous financial impact as well. Swine flu is a very good example of that. That impacted China in the last few years, which saw hundreds of outbreaks and over half of China's breeding pigs being culled or dying as a result. And you can see on the graph on the left that the impact this had by the decrease in the number of pigs available and the huge increase in the price of pigs and pork to the market. But despite all of this, there continues to be a demand in the amount of meat that the world wants to consume. And this isn't slowing down. And a lot of this is related to income as well. As people move into higher income brackets and they have more disposable income, their demand for meat and the amount of meat they consume increases and increases. So one solution is to tell people to eat healthy dishes like this, filled with grains and greens and beans. And we've tried this for many years. Governments have released initiatives to convince people to eat more of these types of foods, but people love the taste of meat and they want to eat more of it. So our theory of change and that of the industry we support is taken from this quote from Y Combinator to make something that people want. And in the case of food, we want to make meat, but make it in a better way. And this is already starting to happen. As you can see here on this graph, the global plant-based meat market continues to grow, and in 2018 reached just under $19 billion. And the growth is expected to increase more and more. On this slide, we've aggregated some of the recent market analyses done by a variety of companies. On the top in green, you can see some of the US market estimates, and down below in orange, some of the global market estimates. And while you can see that there's a wide range of projections from a 6% market share all the way up to a very optimistic 23% market share in the next 10 to 15 years, from what we can see, the consensus is that we're going to get to about a 10% market share of the total meat market. And that's going from about 1 or 2% where we are today. So moving from $19 billion market all the way up to $85 billion and beyond in the next 10 to 15 years. And this rapid growth, it isn't being driven by the vegans and vegetarians of the world that remain roughly about 6% of the global population. It's really these two big segments on the left, the omnivores of the world and the flexitarians of the world. And they love the taste of meat and eggs and dairy, as I mentioned before, but they're wanting to consume these products in a more socially conscious and ethical way. And this is really what's driving this growth. So with that in mind, what are some of the innovations that are happening in the alternative protein industry that are going to push that growth from 1 to 2% market share today to 10% and beyond in the next 10 to 15 years? Well, at GFI, we look at the alternative protein industry in these three technology categories: taking proteins from plants, using microbial fermentation to create proteins and other ingredients, and then using animal cell culture, also called cultured or cultivated meat, to produce proteins and meat that consumers can eat. And while we look at these as three different technology segments, ultimately we actually see this being one industry that works and collaborates together. And food developers and food scientists use ingredients from all three of these technology categories to create products that consumers want to eat. So we might have fully plant-based products like tofu on the left, and fully cultivated or synthetic products like synthetic gelatin or synthetic egg proteins on the right. But in the middle, we'll start to see more and more products that are a blend of these different technologies. In fact, if you're familiar with the Impossible Burger, this is one of the first examples of this that uses predominantly plant-based ingredients, but uses a synthetic or fermented ingredient to improve the flavor of their burger. And when we look at these different technologies, they all follow a similar process, from identifying a source. This could be an animal or a plant or a microbe, optimizing that in some way so that it grows better and produces better end products. And then we grow it. It could be in a tank, it could be on a farm. And then at the end, we take the materials that are produced from that growing process and we process them into a product that consumers are going to want to eat. So now I'll take you through these three technology areas and give you a little bit of insight into the science of each and some of the most important white space ideas. So we'll look at plant-based meat first. And plant-based meat production follows that process that I just described. So we'll identify a source material. This could be a common staple crop like soy or wheat, or a novel crop that works better for these types of applications. We'll optimize that in some way through breeding or genetic engineering, and then we'll isolate and optimize the raw materials from those crops so that we can work with them to construct plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products. And then at the end of this process, food scientists in companies and universities are taking that expanded set of ingredients, that bigger toolbox, and creating unique flavors and textures that mimic the characteristics of conventional meat, egg, and dairy products. One of the primary questions that drives the plant-based meat industry is this question of how do we persuade plant proteins that are globular in nature, they're constructed in a way to store things inside the plant. How do we persuade them to act more like animal proteins, where they're strung out and more fibrillar and cross-linked to provide that texture that you associate with meat products? Well, we can approach this from two general ways. We can apply mechanical methods to reconfigure these proteins, or we can use enzymes to do that as well. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those methods. Today, the industry relies on this instrument that you see here on the slide called a twin screw extruder. This is a big piece of equipment that takes plant protein concentrates and isolates and restructures them so that they're more texturized. And it does this by applying high temperature and high pressure as the protein travels along these rotating screws in this instrument. And this works very well. The industry has used it for years and years, but I think as this industry grows, we're going to need alternative methods, ones that are perhaps more sustainable and more accessible to companies and countries around the world as they start to create more and more plant-based meat products. And two of the most interesting new mechanical methods that are being worked on today are shear cell technology on the left, and this is being developed at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. And this uses rotational forces to reconfigure those plant proteins and create texturized plant-based meat, just like you see there in the image on the left. And then also really interesting is adapting 3D printing or bioprinting technology to create plant-based meat products, texturized plant-based meat products as well. And there's a couple of really interesting companies, Nova Meat in Spain and Redefine Meat in Israel, that are doing really amazing things with bioprinting and plant ingredients to create these texturized meat products. And we can also use enzymes, as I mentioned before. And there's a lot of work starting to happen here. On this slide, what you see is the use of enzymes to reconfigure soy proteins to create an improved texture, a harder texture in a soy pudding in this case. But now scientists around the world in companies and universities are starting to explore novel enzymes that can either be used alone to retexture or texturize plant proteins, or used in combination with extrusion systems or 3D printing to create even better textures. But we don't need to just work on the raw materials. We can go upstream and look at the crops that we use to create plant-based meat products as well. And think about the end product, the types of textures and aromas and flavors that we want to create in plant-based meat products. And think about which crops we use and what we do to them to optimize them further. So we could work with traditional plant-based meat crops like soy and pea, or we could identify new crops like chickpea and lupin and fava bean, and then take those and optimize them through either breeding, precision breeding, or through gene editing technologies like CRISPR to improve the functionality, to remove off flavors, to make these crops even more nutritious by balancing their amino acid profile, making them grow better in certain regions and reducing the cost of work as well. And all of these things combined together can create better raw materials that can then be fed into extruders and 3D printers to create even better plant-based meat products. So when we spoke to these experts in the plant-based meat industry, what types of white space ideas did they identify? Well, there were many of them, but I've listed 4 on this slide that I think are the most interesting. The first is co-manufacturing and product development. So there's a big need right now to support this industry to work from the raw materials from the crop and how we isolate those raw materials that I described before, all the way through to how we texturize these plant proteins and create the final plant-based meat product. And so there's a big white space opportunity for organizations to start creating these end-to-end co-manufacturing facilities to support the plant-based meat industry. There's a huge white space for plant-based seafood products, particularly flaky fish products. Today, plant-based seafood accounts for just about 1% of the overall plant-based meat market. So incredible opportunities there to create seafood products that are made from plants that taste like actual seafood. I mentioned that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of crops that we can use to create better raw materials for plant-based meat. And within each of those plants, there's tens or hundreds of different proteins that we can work with and optimize for plant-based meat applications. And so there's a huge white space to apply bioinformatics to better understand different proteins and how they interact with other ingredients to improve plant-based meat products and help us decide which crops to work with. And then finally, how do we improve plant-based cheeses to create cheese that is more meltable, has a better stretch, a better texture, an improved flavor profile? And so there's a lot of biochemistry starting to be done to better understand plant proteins and how we can optimize them specifically for plant-based cheese applications. Let's move on to fermentation, or microbial fermentation, and how it's now being used as an enabling technology to support both plant-based meat applications and cultivated meat applications that I'll speak about a little bit later. Fermentation, just like plant-based meat, follows a similar production process where we identify a source material that could be a fungus, a bacteria, or an algae, or even a plant cell. And then again, we optimize that in some way through novel mutational methods or gene editing to create a microbe that's optimized for a specific application. And then we grow those and produce more of it. And that's done through a standard fermentation process that's been used in the food and biopharma industry for many, many years, done inside a large bioreactor. And at the end, today, the industry is producing 2 broad types of products, either protein biomass, so using the entire microbial cell and using all of the protein that comes from that as an ingredient, or using fermentation and synthetic biology to produce individual functional proteins that can be used as ingredients in alternative protein products. And we've seen really rapid growth in the number of companies entering into this industry. On the left, with if we look at companies producing protein biomass, the one you're probably all familiar with is corn, that's been on the market for a number of years and is really the pioneer in this fermentation space for alternative proteins. But we're now seeing really interesting companies form, such as Emergy and Atlas Foods, that are using filamentous fungi to create whole cut or whole muscle meat products. And then interesting companies down at the bottom of this slide on the left, such as Air Protein and Solar Foods, that are identifying novel microorganisms that can consume waste streams such as CO2, and then turn that into proteins that we can use as ingredients. And then on the right, there's some really exciting companies creating functional proteins through synthetic biology, dairy proteins, egg and gelatin, and companies such as Motif Foodworks that are creating a platform that can be used to produce many types of functional proteins for the entire industry. And fermentation is going to contribute along this entire alternative protein spectrum that I mentioned earlier in my presentation. So we can use enzymes to improve protein functionality, like I mentioned before, and create a better texture. We can use fermentation to create flavoring ingredients, like the one used in the Impossible Burger. We can use fermentation to produce growth factors that will be used in cultivated meat that I'll speak about in a second. And then, as I hinted on the slide before, we can also use fermentation to create 100% fermentation-derived ingredients, such as synthetic gelatin. And what's really exciting about this fermentation industry is how rapidly ingredients can be disrupted through fermentation. And this slide here gives you a really nice example of some ingredients that have been created through precision fermentation, such as rennet that's used in cheese making, insulin that's used as a therapy for diabetics, and others. And you can see once these recombinant versions or these fermentation-derived ingredients were created and commercialized, you can see how rapidly they took over the total market. And the speed at which this happens is really due to these three factors that you see on the right. How complex is the protein that we're producing through fermentation? What concentration is required in the final product? And then how scarce is the ingredient from a conventional source? And so I think what we'll see in the coming 2 to 3 years is that proteins that are relatively simple in structure, that are present at low concentrations in the final product, and that are replacing proteins that are hard to find through conventional sources. We're going to see a really rapid uptake of those and a disruption of the existing food ingredient market. And again, we surveyed experts in the fermentation space, and they identified these 4 here as the most pressing or important white spaces. The first is using fermentation not just to create proteins as ingredients, but also to create fats and binders as well, to move us away from having to rely on palm oil and coconut fat as the primary fat source in the plant-based meat products of today, to create more nutritional and more functional fats that can be combined into plant-based meat products. As this industry grows, there's going to be a bigger and bigger need for different and more unique feedstocks to feed these microbes that we're growing. So there's a big white space opportunity for a marketplace so that startups and existing companies can understand what feed sources are available, what waste streams can be used as economical sources of fuel for these microbes as we ferment them. And if you think about the taste of meat and the biosynthetic pathways that exist that produce many compounds that add to the flavor and aroma and texture of meat, there's an opportunity here with fermentation to identify all of those molecules. So to move beyond the heme that Impossible Foods use in their product to hundreds of different compounds that exist when we cook and store meat for human consumption, and identify those and produce them through fermentation methods and provide them as ingredients. And we can use those to enhance plant-based meat products and use traditional fermentation methods to improve plant-based meat products as well. If you think back to some of the fermentation products that exist on the market today, like kimchi and yogurt, we already use fermentation to enhance plants, but think of the massive number of combinations that we can use as we expand our toolbox of crops that we work with and different plant proteins, and then the number of microbes that we work with. There's endless combinations of microbes and plant proteins that we can combine together to create better flavors, better aromas, and better textures in plant-based meat products. And then finally, cultivated meat. So if consumers are still wanting to eat meat that comes from actual animal cells, but done so in a far more efficient and sustainable and ethical way, we can use cultivated meat to do that. And this industry has grown incredibly over the past few years since I've been at GFI, and it's now a global industry of close to 60 companies around the world. And you can see all the countries there that currently have cultivated meat startups that are on their way to producing meat made from animal cells. And there are companies on the right of this slide that are producing different types of cultivated meat, from beef, chicken, and pork to seafood and even pet food. And some companies that are making multiple types of meat as well. And this has really grown in the past few years. But what's really exciting, I think, about this space now is the number of B2B or business-to-business startups that are creating technologies that can then be used by the companies on the right to improve their processes and accelerate their march towards commercialization of these products. So we have companies creating novel bioreactors and scaffolds to create three-dimensional meat, to improving cell culture media and reducing the costs, and even creating new cell lines that these companies on the right can use. And how are they doing all of this? How are these pioneers creating meat from cells? Well, again, just like the plant-based and fermentation methods I described before, cultivated meat production follows a similar process. We'll take a sample of cells, typically from a non-invasive biopsy from an animal that we want to work with. We'll then isolate the cells we want to work with from that sample, typically some type of stem cell. We'll then proliferate those cells or expand the number of them in this first phase, where we place these cells inside a tank of some type, provide nutrients for the cells to grow, and then they divide, multiply, and grow, and we end up with far more cells than we started with. Once we have a sufficient number of those cells, we then move to phase 2, into the maturation phase, where we'll move these cells to a different type of tank or bioreactor. In some cases, we'll provide a scaffold that will provide structure as the cells grow in a three-dimensional environment. And this, in the end, will produce a final product that is meat. For all intents and purposes, it contains the same cells arranged in the same three-dimensional structure as conventional meat, and will be comprised of the cells that make up meat: fat, muscle, and fibroblast cells. And this process will take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, so much faster than the time it takes to grow an animal to produce food. So where are we today with this segment of the industry? Well, there's been a lot of promising prototypes, and the companies that I mentioned on the previous slide are doing incredible work. But two of the big challenges that face the industry today are cost and scale. Costs are still in the hundreds of dollars per kilo, and as of today, no pilot scale facilities yet exist. But we're moving closer and closer to this, and there's really great work being done to both reduce the cost of cultivated meat production, and I'll talk a little bit about that on a slide in a couple of minutes. And also, there's a couple of companies now that are moving quite quickly towards pilot scale facilities. So I think we're beginning to address these two big challenges. In the coming years, we'll start to see the scale up of cultivated meat. And once that happens, if we think beyond into the next 10 to 15 years, as this industry grows, what type of capacity are we going to need? What this slide here shows you is the amount of capacity that exists today to support animal cell culture for the biopharma industry. So that's roughly 16.5 million liters of bioreactor capacity around the world. But if we look at, say, capturing 10% of the global meat market by 2030, that was hinted at in one of those analyst reports I mentioned earlier in my presentation, we'll need roughly 4 billion liters of bioreactor capacity. So that's 240 times what exists today globally to support the biopharma industry. So not only do we need to solve these technical challenges that I mentioned before, such as improving the process and reducing the cost of the cell culture media, we're going to need to build these types of manufacturing facilities around the world to support this industry. So when we spoke to our experts in the cultivated meat industry, what types of ideas do they identify as the most important, the most pressing today? The first of those is cell banking. So the industry needs more cells from farm animals to work with, to understand the biology, to improve the techniques that we use to turn those stem cells into meat. And we've recently started a collaboration with a company called TerraFast that's creating a cell line repository, and will be distributing those cells around the world to scientists and universities and in companies. But we need more cells to grow that cell bank. But we also need more banks to be established around the world to support this industry. So there's a big white space opportunity there. And just like in the plant-based meat space, where I talked about the need for co-manufacturing organizations that can support the plant-based meat industry from the crop all the way through to the end product, the same is needed in the cultivated meat industry. Joint ventures that can provide the development and scale up technologies and assistance that all of the startups that I mentioned before will need as they move from early stage experimentation to those pilot scale facilities. And then on the research and development side, to bring the cost of that cell culture media down, that's currently a barrier to reducing the overall costs, we need better growth factors to instruct the cells to grow more efficiently and then ultimately differentiate into the cells that make up meat. And now there are companies starting to work on, and universities as well, on making growth factors more efficient and reducing the cost of them as well. But there's still huge white space opportunities here for more scientists and more entrepreneurs to get involved in improving these growth factors that we use today. And then finally, we need to test the end product for safety and quality. And many of the tools that are in place today for the conventional meat industry are not optimized for cultivated meat. They might require too much of a sample to be used to test for quality, or they might just not be adapted to the technologies or the processes of cultivated meat. So there's a big white space opportunity here to take the existing instruments and equipment that are used to assess conventional meat and adapt them for cultivated meat technology. So I think what I've given you is an insight into these three different technologies: plant-based proteins, fermentation, and cultivated meat, and what types of innovations and white spaces exist to move these industries forward. And as a reminder, these won't be three separate industries that exist in the future. We'll really see these converge together and to create this bigger and more functional set of ingredients that food developers and food scientists around the world can use to create better and better products that match and meet the sensory requirements of consumers that want to eat meat. And it won't just be about creating better ingredients as this industry matures. Ultimately, we'll see the creation of a new feed industry where we're using every part of the plant or the microorganism or side streams or waste streams that are produced as a result of growing those as inputs into this entire alternative protein industry. So as an example, the high molecular weight proteins that come from plants and microorganisms will be used as input into plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products, as I described in my presentation. But we can also take amino acids and small peptides from these processes and use them as fuel in the culturing process for cultivated meat. And even the simple sugars and longer polysaccharides that are potential waste streams or side streams from these processes can then be used as inputs into microbial fermentation, or can be used to create scaffolds to provide those three-dimensional structures that animal cells are going to need to produce meat. So I think we're going to see a lot of really exciting work over the next years to create these new ingredients and figure out ways to create this circular bioeconomy to make this entire industry more efficient and more sustainable. And if you're interested in learning more about any of this, if you're a scientist, we have an incredible amount of resources on our website, from funding opportunities to new technical seminars. In fact, later today, we'll have a technical seminar that you're all welcome to join, where Birgit Dekkers, a scientist in the Netherlands, will be talking about the shear cell technology I mentioned earlier. We've got resources for careers and students that are interested in this industry. And then on the industry side, we have a lot of great resources if you want to go more in depth into some of the market data that I mentioned, some of the science I mentioned, even policy briefings to better understand what's happening in the policy space of alternative proteins. And for all of that, I direct you to our resources page at gfi.org/resources to get access to all of the resources I described today and many more. And with that, I'll pause and we can dive into the Q&A.
Thank you, David. This was very, very interesting. And to prove we have more than 20 questions for you. Let's begin. The first question, what about the GMO barrier?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think it's very regionally dependent. So some regions around the world, some countries are more open to using genetic modification to improve plants or microorganisms, particularly with more modern methods like CRISPR that work very differently than traditional genetic modification. So I think in many ways it's going to be dependent on the country where these products are being launched. But I also hope that as governments around the world see the promise of alternative proteins and the power of using gene editing technologies like CRISPR in an appropriate way, that they'll start to be more open to using these techniques. And then I'll say we don't have to use GM technologies to improve plants or improve microbes. We can use conventional methods to do that as well. And there's really exciting companies. In fact, there's one great company in Israel, Equinome, that is doing just that. They're using novel plant breeding methods to create versions of pea, for example, that have higher protein content that can create better raw materials for plant-based meat.
Thank you. Next question. Do the stem cells need to be reobtained over and over again in order to produce cultivated products?
No. It in some ways depends upon the cell type that is being used by a particular company, whether they're using pluripotent stem cells or a specialized cell type. But at the goal of all of these companies is to create repositories of cells that can then be a small aliquot or sample of those cells can be used to create a new production run of meat. And in many of these companies, researchers are working on ways to make these cells last even longer, and in some cases even become immortal. So they would never need to go back to the original source to access more cells.
Thank you. I think before we move on, maybe it's time to allow Dr. Tom Ben-Aryeh, our senior scientist, to present himself, and maybe Tom could assist us with a few of the questions. So, hi, Tom.
Hey, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Tom, the senior scientist of GFI Israel. My background is mostly on cultivated meat research. That's what I did my PhD on.
Great, Tom. Thank you. So one question is about how long does it take from the time you have a sample of a cell until the time when you can extract the cultivated meat? Tom?
That's a nice question. Usually we talk about around 2 weeks of development from the cells to the tissues. There will be a little bit extra time from the isolation itself until we get to the proliferation, to the exponential proliferation phase. However, that's in a matter of, we talk about a matter of weeks, which is one of the benefits of cultivated meat from the stand that if there are perturbations in the supply chain, if we talk about cows, that can take years to compensate for. However, if we talk about cells, that's much shorter, meaning that we can supply the meat to the customers much more efficiently in that sense.
Thanks, Tom. David, we have a question from Ronnie. He says that you've had a great presentation, and he asks if you think that in 10 years from now, plant-based products will be so good in texture and taste and in price that there will no longer be any need for cultivated meat.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it depends on the type of product that you're thinking about. So I think with the really amazing improvement in some of the ground meat products like burgers and simple products like chicken nuggets, just by using plants, I think it's likely that it will be very hard to distinguish those from conventional meat products, and they may even be, by that point, even better than what exists today as the, the best burger in the world. I think we'll see plant-based versions in 10 years that are even better than something you can imagine today. But I think that for more complex products like steaks and fish, I think that's where cultivated meat technology can provide a lot of benefits to create those three-dimensional structures. But as I hinted at in my presentation, I think what we're likely to see are blends or hybrid products where much of the ingredients come from plants, and then we're adding in fat or muscle from cultivated meat technology to create an even better tasting product.
Yeah, I agree. We have an interesting question from Eshchar. Maybe Tom could take it. Tom, what do you think are the expected advantages of cultivated meat versus plant-based meat? And when do you see the first products coming to market, maybe hybrid products?
Okay, so in terms of time, when will be the first product, I don't know. And that's I guess that some companies claim that they can do it next year or something like that. We hope that that's true. But as a scientist, I really don't know the answer about when will it happen. The advantages are that if you are trying to recapitulate meat using plants, so you take some kind of proteins that could mimic meat, and that can really be good. However, if you go to cultivated meat, the cells produce the same pattern of molecules as they are in meat from live animals. So from that sense, you have this kind of advantage. So you don't need to try to engineer something. It's exactly the same. And even maybe we can make some improvements. Basically, some molecules exist in animals that don't exist in plants. We can try to solve it with fermentation. However, as of now, you just don't need to engineer much in cells. So that's a key advantage.
Thanks, Tom. We have another great question from Michelle. Hi, Michelle. Michelle is managing our student cell at the Tel Aviv University, and she is asking, how do you see the academia's role versus private companies? David?
Yeah, I think academia plays a really critical role in this entire industry. I think, there's a lot of fundamental research that needs to take place to improve our understanding of, say, how plant proteins can be restructured to create better texturized products. The processes that Tom described in cultivated meat to turn stem cells into muscle and fat. All of this requires work from academia to create open access research that can then further our understanding or be used by the companies around the world to create better products. And that's one of the reasons that we at GFI fund and support so much open access research in academia.
Thanks, David. Tom, we have a nice question from Sapir. She asked, which cells are taken from the animal, and is it a painful process for the animal?
Hey, thank you so much for the question. So cells that we are interested in are skeletal muscle cells, adipose cells or fat cells, and also fibroblasts, and also the embryonic cells that can be differentiated into these cell types, whether we are talking about mesenchymal stem cells, embryonic stem cells, and even perhaps the use of fibroblasts in order to generate induced pluripotent stem cells that we can later generate the cells that we are interested for. If I remember correctly, you asked if they are taken in a harmful way. So first of all, the answer is no. That's something that is extremely important to us, either to do it with in a biopsy or in a way that doesn't harm the animals. And one of our targets is to generate to at the end find a way to take the cells in a way that to take cell types in a way that will not require us to take other samples in the future. So at least I hope that I answered that fully.
I will give you an A for your question, for your answer. David, we have a question from Ayelet. Ayelet is asking, you know that plant-based foods have been around for about 30 years now. mostly based on soy. And she asked, what has changed? The technology is relatively the same. More people are now interested in these products. What has changed in plant-based foods in the recent decades?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And in fact, I think you could say that plant-based meat has existed for thousands of years, right? If you think about tofu, but it's true that at least more modern plant-based meat products have existed for 10 to 20, 30 years. And what's really changed is if you think back to that slide in the beginning of my presentation about the different segments that are pushing the growth of this industry, it's not now vegans and vegetarians that are wanting these foods. It's also the flexitarians and omnivores. And because they want products that taste just like meat and have the same textures and aromas and all the sensory attributes, this has changed the way that plant-based meat companies are thinking about creating these products. So moving from just creating a plant-based meat product that it works in terms of sitting between two slices of bread, right, and achieves that purpose, to a burger or a chicken breast that tastes just like a conventional burger or chicken breast. And this, in the past, say, 5 years or so, is really what's changed the market, that where the industry is now focused on biomimicry of conventional animal meat, egg, and dairy products.
Thanks, David. We'll take one more question, and then we will skip to some closure slides. And then, because we have over 30 questions left, we will get back and try to answer as much as we can. So last question, and I think Tom can take it. Karen is asking, what about the vegan people? Are they going to be able to eat cultivated meat? And are these products targeted for the vegan audience?
Yeah, so the products are not targeted for vegans. However, they are vegan in the sense that the amount of ingredients that actually came from the animals, I would estimate that when you cook a cultivated meat burger, there will be more animal products or animal ingredients that fall off your hand into the burger rather than ingredients that came from the original animal. Basically, there will be probably not even one atom that came from the animal, so I would say that that's considered vegan. However, that's not something that's not our aim to generate something like that. The philosophical question doesn't concern us that much whether you consider it vegan or not. Basically, it will not contain some materials that came from the animal. However, it will be the same exact molecule or the same exact product on the molecular level.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. Now a few closure slides, and then we'll get back to the Q&A. So if you have wondered who are the wonderful people behind GFI Israel, well, here they are. Or Benjamin is our Director of Operations. Tom, you just got to know. Hadass is our Marco Manager, and the wonderful Schneidman is our Executive Assistant. You can reach all of us through israel@gfi.org. This is our email. And we are also hiring nowadays. 3 very exciting positions are still open. Academic Relations Manager, this will be the person that will coordinate all of our work with the Israeli academia. The second position is Business Engagement. This person will be in charge of all of our work with food manufacturers, investors, startups, etc. Again, very exciting. And Policy Manager. This person will lead the creation of a national policy plan together with some ministries here in Israel. We'll coordinate this plan and we'll work with all of us and our colleagues around the world. And if you are passionate about what we do, then we invite you to take a look at the job descriptions that I believe we shared here in the chat right now. And also you can find them on our Facebook and LinkedIn pages at the Good Food Institute Israel. We have a few additional events. So earlier this week, we had 2 events. One was only for investors. Another one was targeted at the Agritech community. Next week, we have 3 new events. On Sunday at 7, we are having an event with the Color School of Management and the Tel Aviv University, which will focus on business opportunities in plant-based and cultivated protein. On Monday, we are having an exciting event. I think it's the world's first regarding cellular agriculture, harnessing fermentation to feed the world. And this is done with our great partners at the Israeli Fermentation Association and the Weizmann Institute. And if you haven't had enough, then on Tuesday, we are at the Hebrew University. Well, we will all be again from home, but the Zoom event will be shared together with our friends from the Hebrew University. Now let's go back to some more Q&A. And if you are leaving us now, then thank you for being with us. We'll of course share the presentation and slides. David and Tom, we have 32 more questions. So let's pick it up. Jordan is asking, hi Jordan, how do you foresee growth factor costs being reduced for cultivated meat? David?
Yeah, I can take this, and then Tom can jump in if he has other thoughts as well. So I think a couple of ways. So we can make these growth factors more efficient, so less of them are needed during the culture process. There's also interesting things that we could do by attaching some growth factors to the scaffolds that would be part of the cultivated meat process. So then again, less of them would be required. But there's also just the point of economies of scale. As this industry grows and the industry needs more and more of these growth factors, we'll produce more of them and the costs will come down as a consequence. So I think it's going to be a combination of these two things that happen, that companies and researchers around the world focus on creating more efficient versions of these, specifically for food applications, and then the industry grows to provide more of them.
Yeah, I can add that in addition to that, also that Liz Speck from GFI, she wrote a paper about how to reduce the cost of media, or essentially about the considerations of how media costs are, and basically how several directions of how we can reduce the cost. In addition to that, some idea that I think that could be relevant is co-culture of different cell types. If we can, basically in our body, we don't add the growth factors from outside. There are some cells that produce the growth factors, some cells that use them. It's a signaling molecule. If we can take the cells that can produce those growth factors and co-culture them in some way, maybe not specially in the same area, but if we can do some kind of co-culture or some kind of conditioning media from the cells that produce the growth factors into the cells that we want to harvest afterwards, I think that's an interesting way to solve the problem of the growth factors without, that can really reduce dramatically the cost of basically not using growth factors at all.
Thanks, Tom. We have a question from Lior. She is asking, which resources could beginners in this field use in order to keep up with the pace? David, maybe?
Yeah, first I would say to head over to our resources page that that I highlighted in my presentation. I think there's a link in the chat as well. One resource I would really recommend is our online course or MOOC that takes you through all of the science of alternative proteins in more detail. It's a multi-week course. It's free, and you can sign up on our website. But there's a huge number of resources that exist at gfi.org as well.
Thanks. Ronen is asking, which scientific expertise, other than the ones close to this field, could be used for alternative protein? Tom, which other scientific expertise could be used in our field?
Sorry, I was writing something in the chat. Can you repeat the question?
Which other fields of expertise in the field of science could be used to promote alternative protein research?
Oh, wow. So basically all of them, I think, but if we can focus, I think that specifically anything related to food engineering, biology, chemistry, mechanical engineering, maybe I will say it slower, But for mechanical engineering, in order to develop any kind of machinery that could be relevant for that, one of the questions that were before about bioinformatics, so generating any kind of tools, I also added there a paper that explains how bioinformatics could be used for alternative protein research, but mostly for cultivated meat. Anything related to plant science, plant genetics. It's hard to think about. Basically, if you have any kind of specific, basically just tell us what kind of field you are in, and we will tell you how this can go into the field. We'll be happy to give you the counseling. And of course, I didn't mention, but meat science is something that is extremely important for us. Also, biomedical engineering. But the way to approach this, I think, is just come to us, tell us what you have or what you are interested in, and we'll be happy to support you and explain to you how you can join the field.
Thanks. David, can you talk a bit about the sustainability side of things? How much water can be saved by using alternative protein? What is the difference between plant-based and cultivated meat in the sustainability regard?
Yeah, this is a great question. And obviously, because cultivated meat is not yet a commercialized technology, we don't know as much as we do from plant-based meat. But in general, what we see is huge amounts of land savings, more than 90% land savings compared to conventional animal agriculture, massive water savings as well. And also improvements in almost a complete reduction in eutrophication, which is the runoff of waste into lakes and streams. Some of the plant-based meat companies, such as Impossible Foods and Kellogg's Morningstar brand and Beyond Meat, have produced their own life cycle assessments, which we also link to from our resources page, where you can explore in more depth how these products are more sustainable and more environmentally friendly than their animal-based counterpart. And in the case specifically of cultivated meat, what we know today, at least from early research that's been done, is that, again, there are huge savings on land, massive savings on water use and eutrophication. What's unclear right now is how much energy will be required to power these big manufacturing facilities that I spoke about before. But we're right now, GFI is in the middle of a new life cycle assessment in collaboration with a number of companies in the industry to better understand this, so that we can then figure out, what are the energy requirements or the techno-economic requirements of cultivated meat, and over the next 5 to 10 years, as the industry grows, identify the most promising energy sources to power these new plants. So more to come, but it's a great question.
Indeed. We have a great question about precision fermentation. What are some of the high-value specialty protein ingredients besides heme from Impossible Foods? Either of you could take it.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think there's some really obvious ones, right? Like dairy and egg proteins that are used as either ingredients to create products like cheese and ice cream, but they're also used in many meat products as well as binders or emulsifiers. And so there's a lot of opportunities there to create recombinant versions of these proteins through precision fermentation as ingredients. And then in terms of like heme-like molecules, I think this is an open field, right? There's a lot of work being done now to identify other molecules like heme that could add to the flavor profile of these products. And there might be unique ones for certain seafood food products that we eat, or chicken or beef might have other ones. And some of this work is happening inside companies like Impossible Foods and others, but we're now starting to see research in this area to identify some of these new compounds in the academic space as well. So I think over the next couple of years, you'll see more and more of these interesting proteins being identified.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions regarding cultivated fish. Are there any specific cell lines developed for fish species, and which culture media is presently being used for seafood?
Yeah, I can take the cell line one, and then maybe Tom can talk about the culture media. So there are very few seafood or aquatic-based cell lines available today. Most of the ones that exist are owned by and developed by cultivated seafood companies. But we recently just started an initiative through our Sustainable Seafood project at GFI to create new cultivated seafood lines in collaboration with a company in the US called Moat Marine, who has expertise in aquaculture and seafood biology. And so they're going to be creating a number of aquatic cell lines that will then be deposited in the cell bank that I mentioned before and be available to researchers around the world. That work's just starting, but in the next couple of years, we're going to see more and more of those and more work from scientists around the world to create even more cell lines. Tom, do you have any thoughts on the cell culture media?
So the only thing I can think of is the fact that it will be a bit more difficult to figure out the cell culture media for different cell types because there is a huge variety of them compared to bovine. However, since I'm not an expert in fish, I think that it will be better to send such a question to someone like Claire. She might know better than I do about how to culture these cell types. But the general question is that I really don't have the expertise about fish.
Okay, we have, of course, we haven't talked about the coronavirus. So maybe one of you want to talk about how will the new pandemic impact the field of alternative protein development? Does it have even any promising possibilities for this field?
Yeah, I think so. I think in some ways it's difficult to tell right now everything that's going to happen because there's still so much uncertainty. Just in terms of like the way that we're consuming food because of the outbreak has changed, right? So no one or very few people are going out to eat. Everyone is eating at home. So this changes the way that we think and buy and consume food. And I think this will have longer lasting impacts on the way that we consume food. I hope that this will increase the way that people think about their food choices in the future and how we use animals for food. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is just what I've been really impressed by from a scientific perspective is how the academic and scientific industry has come together to research and innovate around coronavirus to create new tests and develop new vaccines and therapies. And I think that just shows you the power of science, right? And we've started to see that already in the alternative protein industry where talented scientists and engineers around the world are coming together to tackle these problems that exist in the alternative protein industry. And I think this also gives you an example if we can tap into even more of that scientific power and industrial power in the future, we'll be able to grow this industry even faster.
I will add and emphasize that in that direction, all of those zoonotic diseases and the use of antibiotics, at least for me, that's a main reason why we should just generate meat with cleaner conditions, either without using, because when you grow so many animals, hundreds of billions of animals in crowded conditions, there will be problems. There will be safety problems. And if we can try to culture organisms like plants or or bacteria that don't use, that are not similar to us. So the bacteria or the diseases that they have are very different from us. I think that will be better. If we think about using fermentation or plant-based, and if we use cultivated meat, then the fact that we generate the meat in sterile and GMP conditions, in conditions that are very controlled and very repeatable and reproducible, I think that this will be a great advantage in terms of food safety. So hopefully we can generate the food better that way.
This brings us to the next question about food safety. How can we make sure that cultivated meat and new alternative protein foods do not harm humans? Can you speak a little bit about the regulation? David, maybe we can talk a bit about what's happening in the US right now.
Yeah, this is an important question, and regulatory agencies around the world are thinking about all of this now and working towards creating guidelines that will be both fair for the companies launching products and also ensure safety for consumers as well. So in the US, the FDA and USDA will be jointly regulating cultivated meat, and these are the questions they're thinking about. So what types of tests need to be in place to ensure that these the processes that are being used to manufacture cultivated meat are safe and that the end product is safe. I will say one of the big advantages of cultivated meat is that it's happening inside a clean facility, and this will allow not only for the environment to be controlled in a much better way than, say, conventional animal agriculture, which is typically in a very open environment and often not that clean, but also the fact that we're growing cells in a contained bioreactor allows us to sample through the entire process, right? So when we take the initial sample of cells, we can test for quality and safety. We can test as much as we want during the culture process, and then at the very end we can test as well. So this, because of the transparency and access to the cells that this technology provides, I think this will ultimately create a much safer product for consumers.
Thank you. Tom, apparently you have a few fans here in the webinar. One is saying, "Hi Tom, you look great. How do you tackle the issue of mutations acquired over time in highly proliferated cells? Sorry."
Yeah, so I guess that you have mutations everywhere, also in our body, also in the bodies of the animals that we consume. They are happening everywhere. However, the fact that we grow them in a controlled environment means that we can check those. And if we see any kind of problem, we can actually try to replace the sample or basically it depends on what kind of mutation you have. If we see a harmful or a negative mutation, we can remove the sample or do something like that, which is a key advantage compared to growing the cells inside of an animal where we don't know anything about what's happening there and what kind of mutations occurred. So at least from that perspective, if we can make karyotypes and things like that, we can make sure that everything is safe, especially on the earlier stage where those cells affect all of the cells that will occur, that will be proliferated from them.
Thank you. I have a question about lipids. Which ones could be only produced through fermentation and not by plants?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think that you know, there's some really good fats that we can just take directly from plants. In my presentation, I mentioned coconut fat, which is being used because of its functional properties in many of these modern plant-based meat products. But as this industry grows, we're going to need more sources and potentially more nutritious fats as well, right, that have been optimized in some way. So I think it's less about you know, specifically which fats can be created, but thinking more about the functional and nutritional requirements of these plant-based meat products. How can we better encapsulate fats along with the plant-based proteins to create a better texture, better mouthfeel? Can we improve the nutritional attributes of these fats? So to create a product that's more nutritious for still creating that mouthfeel that you associate with a meat product that has fat in it, but providing it far more nutritious end product as well. So I think this area of research is just starting, and as to my knowledge, there aren't any products on the market yet, but I think we'll see more of those in the coming years.
Thanks. Can you talk a little bit about the opportunity in seafood and fish alternatives, and specifically refer to algae-derived proteins?
Yeah, as I hinted at in my presentation, the seafood area is wide open. There are not that many alternative seafood products on the market. In the last year or so, we started to see some more launched and of higher quality as well, getting closer to biomimicking certain seafood types. But I think the space is wide open, whether we're using plants to create seafood alternatives, or using cultivated technology, as Tom described before, to create seafood. And then algae, I think, is really interesting. We're funding some research in seaweed to look at proteins that can be derived from seaweed and other ingredients that could be inputs into plant-based meat products in general. But I think there's specific applications in seafood alternatives where algae is going to be a really important tool. So I think it's just wide open right now. So anyone that's interested in seafood, I think, or interested in alternative proteins, I think seafood is a really promising place to go. And I think, you know, if you look at some of the impacts that the terrestrial animal agriculture industry is having on the planet in terms of global warming and pollution, it's even worse in our oceans with some of the overfishing that's happening and really depleting our oceans of aquatic life. And so I think there's big opportunities to improve our food system from on the seafood side as well.
We have a question from Oren regarding novel crops. How does GFI see the opportunities in novel crops? What do you think about basic phases of research? And where should we focus our efforts regarding novel crops?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I think that there's important work that can be done with the crops that we currently use, like soy and pea, to further optimize them for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy applications. But in terms of novel crops, it's wide open right now. We're starting to see more work in this area. For example, we're funding a research project in Israel, in Ophir Benjamin's lab, to optimize quinoa as an input into plant-based meat products. And so I think the key when thinking, what we think about when we think about novel crops is the end product, right? Do the proteins from that particular crop offer some type of functional advantage so it can either be used as a standalone ingredient or combined with other plant proteins to create a better flavor and a better texture, but also thinking about it from a sustainability and efficiency perspective as well. Is it a crop that grows well in particular regions and doesn't require a huge amount of water? Can it be rotated with other crops to improve the conditions of the land that we're using to grow these plants? So it's really thinking about both the functional attributes of the raw materials from the crop, and then the sustainability angle as well. And ultimately, can we bring the cost of it down, right? So that it provides ingredients that can be competitive with animal-based ingredients.
We have another great question for Michelle, who manages our student group in the Tel Aviv University. Michelle is asking about cell differentiation. How do you see basic research regarding cell differentiation, like skeletal or muscle and fat from embryonic stem cells regarding cultivated meat? Where should the research go? Maybe Tom could take it?
Sure. So first of all, if we are trying to understand better how to differentiate cells from animals rather than humans, that's something that is important. In addition to that, figuring out how to do it with food-grade materials rather than materials that we won't be able to use for cultivated meat. And in addition to that, doing it on, we already know how to do some kind of differentiation. Maybe understanding how to do it from the right cells that we are interested in, perhaps from the embryonic cells and the iPSs. We have some research done on that through our grant program about differentiation towards the cells of interest. Let me see, I don't remember the beginning of the question, but basic research for cell-fate differentiation from embryonic stem cells. Yeah, basically now, at least for bovine embryonic stem cells, there are recent works that try to generate those embryonic stem cells and make them stable. From there to the final differentiation, I think that could be marvelous, especially for the direction of removing the requirement to isolate cells from the animals every time. I think that's something that could be very valuable in that sense. And also, another direction is because the fact that when you use mature stem cells, such as satellite cells, usually the cells are not aimed to develop an entire tissue. Their aim is to repair the tissue, while if you use more embryonic cells, you can that are more that can perhaps recapitulate the developmental process. Maybe perhaps those cells will mimic the actual skeletal muscle tissue more accurately.
We have many questions on marketing, PR, consumer research, etc. I suggest that you will attend a marketing webinar that we will hold after Passover, and we'll be giving some answers regarding the marketing side of alternative protein. So we will not take those questions now, as we have the world's leading scientists in this field with us, and I want to direct questions regarding science. Maybe we'll take one or two more questions. Tom, Shelley is asking about consumer acceptance as well, but let's talk about the scientific side of it. How does the scientific research change and adapt itself in order to overcome some consumer acceptance challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, one of our aims in order to fit with the consumer is to use cells without genetic engineering. And that's something that at least is favorable towards that direction, specifically if we talk about Europe. Although there is no problem with genetic engineering, I think that's something that could be important for consumer acceptance. In addition to that, if we can, just for a good example for Israel, if we can generate actual novel products that will be better than meat that we can generate meat which is exactly the same like meat that we have currently now. However, we can perhaps develop meat which will be better. For example, generating meat that will be a combination of muscle from cows, from bovine, and adipose cells or fat cells from sheep. Generating all of these new products that couldn't be generated currently, I think that's something that could be very interesting to the consumer, trying to test things like that. Also, if we talk about consumer acceptance, generating products that they cannot have, for example, like plant-based bacon, or maybe in the future we will agree that cultivated pig will be kosher. If things like that will happen, we are generating a great market as well. If we can think about the combination of meat from a parve meat with cheese, that's something that could be favorable. Basically, if we can just generate novel products which will be better for the consumer, and that's a main advantage of cultivated meat and plant-based meat, that when you engineer something, you can engineer something that is currently unavailable. And I think that's something that could lead people to buy because it will just be better. So at least I hope that that's answered the question better. Well.
Thanks. We also got a lot of questions from investors regarding materials. How can they get connected to some of the startups? Well, I suggest you check out our website. We have many databases about companies, and many resources for investors. So check out our website at gfi.org/resources, and you will find resources for each audience, manufacturers, company, investors, entrepreneurs, etc. Really worth a visit. If you have additional questions that we didn't answer, feel free to contact us at israel@gfi.org. Last question, how did the soybean call its mother? Adamami. That will be all. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, David. Thank you, Tom. Chag Sameach.
Thanks, everyone.